We're on an island off the northeast coast of Northumberland. Currently, we're about 15 miles south of the Scottish border, which if you go up to Berwick, that's more or less where the Scottish border starts. It runs along the Tweed. That has no relevance to our period because that Anglo-Scottish border only emerges in the 11th century. So in the period I'm interested in, so we're talking 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, Northumberland or Northumbria goes all the way up to Edinburgh at its greatest extent, all the way over to the other side of the country, all the way down to the Humber. So I think rather than thinking about Lindisfarne as being northern England, it's best to think about this whole kingdom as being central Britain. I think it's the easiest way to characterise it. And it kind of looks north to Scotland and the Picts and the Irish kingdoms in western Scotland, and it looks south towards the Anglo-Saxons. So it's a kind of hinge point culturally, and as well as being slap bang in the middle. The island, I mean, you can see it's a tidal island. We know it's a tidal island all the way back to the early medieval period. Bede is very clear, who's writing about this in the 730s, that Lindisfarne is a tidal island. Nowadays, when you came in, you'd have come in on the causeway over from Beal. Now that causeway, and that was laid out in the 1950s, you may have noticed actually the footway, if you want to walk across the sands, that goes straight across to Beal. But if you go back to the 17th and 18th century, when you have the first maps, the main way onto the island was actually straight across from the village, straight that way, and we can't quite see, and I'm not going to wander around, but there's a little village called Fenham, or a big hamlet called Fenham, and that's where the causeway originally ran to. And we know from the medieval documents that Fenham was the estate centre of all the land that Lindisfarne held on the shore immediately opposite us. Just to orientate ourselves, obviously that's north, south, east, west. So up that way, those hills you can see over there are Scotland. Up there, and Berwick's not far. And on a good day, you can see as far as St Abb's Head, which is another site with an Anglo-Saxon monastic site on. If you go to the south, that little sandy bit, that's Ross Point. But over there, you can see very impressively Bamborough Castle. And although the castle itself is mainly Norman and later heavily restored, it's got an Anglo-Saxon site underneath, and we know it's a major palace site for Anglo-Saxon kings. And finally, well, not finally, but over there you can see the islands. They're the Farne Islands. They're very important because St Cuthbert spent time on Inner Farne, which is the one on the far right, as a hermit, and that's important. I'll come back to that. And then finally, you can see, in terms of on the island itself, we've got this nice big ridge we're standing on. It's called the Hugh, Heugh. Everybody pronounces it completely differently. So it's Hugh, Huff, Hoof, Hoof. No matter what I say, someone else says something different. And this is built on this kind of outcrop of basalt, which is very, 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 very hard rock and doesn't erode. And the same outcrop forms Lindisfarne Castle over there. That's not a medieval castle, that's primarily a Henry VIII and later defence. And initially it was built to defend against the Scots, and then the castle as you see it now was constructed to defend against Dutch piracy. So Dutch were raiding here in the 16th and 17th, particularly the 17th century. So that's why that was built. There's actually a little fort at the end of the Hoof, which is also an early artillery fort. The geography of the island hasn't changed that much. The sea level hasn't changed that much over a long period. We're at the point where sea level going up and sea level going down in Britain kind of evens itself out, so we're at a hinge point. Other big changes, apart from the causeway, all the sand dunes, which are very typical of the north side of the island and on the way in, they're all late medieval or post-medieval, from the bad weather of a little ice age. And on aerial photographs you can see medieval fields going underneath the sand dunes, so they're clearly quite late. The other only minor change is not to do with sea level, but it is due to the changing shape of the coast. Up until the late 18th century, you've got the harbour there. It originally actually came in much closer to our field. So you know how the field we're in drops down? That was the original edge of the harbour, and it kind of ran around. You can see there's a bit of open water scrape around there, and that land was only reclaimed in the late 18th century when they relaid out all the fields. So that's a common period when the field systems are relaid out in the UK. So that's the village itself. And also you've got the village here. You've got rocky shores along the north side. So that's the island itself. Why have we got a monastery here? Well, I should say that I'm primarily an early medievalist, so I work on the Anglo-Saxons. Once it gets to Normans, I get a bit bored, frankly. It's all industrial archaeology after that point. So we need to take a couple of steps back. We're well north of Hadrian's Wall. So Hadrian's Wall, for most of the Roman period, that marks the edge of Roman Britain. I mean, there's a brief period when it's a bit further north. So through the Roman period, we're basically in a world of this part of northern England where it's essentially Iron Age. People are living in hill forts. There's big hill forts inland, and we have crop marks showing little hill forts and defending enclosures all the way along the coastal strip opposite us. So it was very heavily occupied. So a lot of people, heavily farmed, quite a well-developed landscape. We know from the archaeology and historical sources that through the Roman period, although we always think of Hadrian's Wall as defending against the wild and woolly barbarians, actually there's a big Roman buffer zone running along north of Hadrian's Wall. So here we're probably in an area where the Iron Age tribes were actually quite friendly with the Romans and were kind of supported as a kind of buffer state. And it only starts getting really complex further north. But by the end of the Roman period, the Picts, certainly from further up in Scotland, are raiding into northern England, and it's possible that the tribes up here start getting a bit antsy and start picking fights with the Romans as they become increasingly on the back foot. So we have emerging in the 5th and 6th centuries after the Romans go, powerful British early medieval kingdoms. And when I use the term British, I'm using it in a technical sense, basically in a linguistic sense. So the kingdoms up here were speaking an old Celtic language, which is essentially an ancestor of Old Welsh. So we have these great Welsh-speaking kingdoms talking about they can mythologise these old northern Welsh kingdoms as in Hen Ogle, the Old North. So they talk about this in their later stories about it was a wonderful good period when the Welsh ruled big chunks of Britain. The Anglo-Saxons come in. Anglo-Saxons are, broadly speaking, they are Germanic groups coming over from northern Germany, southern Scandinavia. There is a huge debate about the nature of those Anglo-Saxon migrations, whether they are mass migrations with complete population replacement, whether it's a small group coming in and taking over from the top. I'm not even going to start with that because it's incredibly complicated. There's more hot air than light. I'm on the minimalist side rather than maximalist side, and certainly even those who argue for the greatest migration accept that up here in the far north it was quite small scale. But anyway, we get these emergent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. We certainly know one of them is based at Bamborough, but they're pagan. They're pagan Anglo-Saxon. The kingdom of Northumbria consolidates itself out of two smaller kingdoms, Deira, which is broadly Yorkshire, and Bernicia, which is broadly this area, and no one's quite sure where the dividing line between the two is. Probably somewhere in County Durham, but again, more heat than light on that argument. So the Anglo-Saxons are pagan. They start converting to Christianity in the 7th century. They initially start converting because of a missionary sent by Gregory the Great, Pope in Rome. He sends St. Augustine to Kent. So Kent's in the far southeast. Kent always had very close links with the Frankish kingdoms in northern France. And the pagan king in the late 6th century, the Kentish king was married to a Christian Frankish princess. So I think that helped stimulate that conversion process. So Augustine comes in AD 597. The Kentish kings and their retinues, they convert to Christianity. Now the king up here at that point is King Edwin, and he's very powerful. He's unified Northumbria into one kingdom by that point. As a mark of status, he wants to marry a Kentish princess because Kent's such a powerful kingdom. So he marries a Kentish princess, and the deal is he has to convert to Christianity, and she comes up and she brings her private chaplain called Paulinus, and he starts that conversion process. So there's a series of mass baptisms in York, in Catterick, further down on the edge of North Yorkshire, and also at a site called Yevering inland, about 15 miles inland, which we know is a major palace site. So Edwin and his family, they adopt Christianity, but they adopt a particular flavour of Christianity with those links to Kent and Francia and kind of very directly to Rome. So that's all well and good. Now, like most Anglo-Saxon kings, Edwin gets killed in battle. It's kind of occupational hazard. He's succeeded by his nephew Oswald. And again, the occupational hazard of being a successor, an heir to a kingdom, is people want to kill you. So Oswald grows up in exile. He grows up in exile in western Scotland in an Irish-influenced kingdom called Dalriada, which is kind of Argyll, that area. There, he converts to Christianity as well, probably at Iona, which is a big Irish monastery off the west coast of Mull in Scotland. So when Oswald comes back, takes up his rightful place, obviously he's got his big power site down in Bamborough, he brings with him monks from Iona, and the key monk is Aidan, really. And together Oswald and Aidan found Lindisfarne. and it's very hard to resist the idea that he's trying to create an Iona in the east. He's seen what a big, powerful monastery looks like, and he wants to do his own one on his doorstep over here. So I think that's what's happening. So the early days of Lindisfarne, it's an Irish-influenced monastery, Irish-Scottish monastery. So the Northumbrian kingdom, for about 30 years, everything ticks along slightly awkwardly because you've got Irish Christians and you've got kind of Frankish, Kentish, Roman Christians both sharing the same households, which means you get to situations where Oswald's successor, Oswy, he's busy having a big feast at the end of Easter because his Easter is over, while his wife, who follows the other tradition, is still having a fast. So it's not a recipe for domestic harmony, but it's also about other things. It's about celebration of Easter, obviously. It's about, there's complicated things about how you see bishops and power obligations. But I think even more than that, it's about a social thing. It's about whether Northumbria sees itself as part of the northern world of the Picts and the Irish, or whether it sees itself as part of the Anglo-Saxon world. So in AD 664, there's a big church meeting, a synod at Whitby in North Yorkshire, and Oswy has to make a decision about whether we're all going to be Irish or we're all going to be Anglo-Saxon Christians. And he goes with the Anglo-Saxon tradition of Christianity. The key figure in the debate at the synod is Colman, who's the Irish Bishop of Lindisfarne. Obviously, when he loses, he leaves Lindisfarne because he's on the losing side, and he takes some of the monks, and they go back to Iona. Then they go off to Western Ireland to a settled monastery in Inishbofin, an island off the west coast, and he comes inland to Mayo and sets up another monastery there. So we've got a problem. We've got a great big monastery, very important. Normally, every monastery has its great founding saint, and that becomes the central figure for culting and worship and devotion. But here we've got a problem because Aidan, he was connected with the old church, so they need a new broom, a kind of new kind of a rebranding exercise, I suppose, in a slightly kind of anachronistic way. And the great thing is, this new figure comes in, Saint Cuthbert, who's the figure most associated with Lindisfarne. He's a nobleman. He joins the church. He comes from Scottish borders. He joins the church probably at Melrose, becomes a monk, becomes very, very important very quickly. He's got a reputation as a man of great holiness and a hermit, as well as being a good administrator. So he comes in as the bishop / abbot. He's a safe pair of hands. He's ideologically okay. He's with the Roman side rather than the Irish. But he doesn't always. He's not a natural fit for being a leader, and he wants to also spend time as a hermit. So he spends time down on St. Cuthbert's Island, which is just down there. And then ultimately he goes off to Innerfarne over there, and that's where he dies as a hermit. And it's not great for Cuthbert, but it's great for Lindisfarne, because even better than having a live figurehead, they've got a dead figurehead at that point who is attached to the right part of the church. So he's brought back, he's buried, probably on where the later church is there somewhere, and then within 10 years they dig him up. They see he's not decomposed, he's increased, not corrupted, and that's a sign that he's a saint. And there's no bureaucracy involved in Anglo-Saxon sainthood. It's just by acclamation. So that at that point, his remains are lifted out of the grave and put above the ground with a shrine, and that process is called translation. But that's the point really when he becomes a saint, and he becomes the kind of founding father, even though it's really Aidan. And that's where the real pilgrimage starts to Holy Island. And it's probably about this time that the Lindisfarne Gospels are created. So they date to around the decades after Cuthbert's death. And I think it's probably fair to say that those Gospels are created as part of a whole programme of promotion of the cult of St. Cuthbert and reinvestment. There's lots of other things I can go into, lots of technical detail, but I think it's a period where we're seeing a lot of development of the monastery. So it becomes really important. It gets huge amounts of land. It's given lots of land. So basically, apart from over there, all the land you can see, running all the way up to Berwick, is a big lump of land called Island Shire. It's a shire that belongs to the island. They own land all the way up the Tweed, another big estate called Norhamshire. Then they own land all the way up into Scottish borders and into East Lothian, almost up to Edinburgh. Then they own big chunks of County Durham, big chunks of South Northumberland, and bits of Yorkshire. So they become, and bits all over the place, frankly. So they become very rich, very powerful, centre of learning, most important monastery in northern Britain, essentially. So everything's going all well and good and ticking along very nicely. And then late 8th century, the Vikings turn up, and that's a very celebrated attack. Is either, depending who you read, is either the first or second Viking attack on Britain. It was very early actually for Viking attacks, so that gets a huge amount of kind of, gets mentioned by Bede, because Bede's mainly writing before the main period of Vikings. So for him, so it's one of the few Vikings attacks Bede really knows about. So he writes about it. Alcuin, who is a Northumbrian monk from York, who ends up in the court of Charlemagne in northern Gaul, he writes about it. So it gets a lot of kind of, a lot of attention. But actually, after that first attack, things calm down for a while, and the tempo of Viking attacks doesn't get going till the mid 9th century, the 850s, 860s. And then if you follow the conventional histories, the histories written by the Norman monks from Durham, at that point in the 860s, everybody leaves, and they take all the relics and they go inland, and they take the relics to Norham, the big estate on the Tweed, then they go over to the west coast and they go down to Chester-le-Street near Durham, and then in the end of the 10th century, those monks and the relics moved to Durham itself and found a new monastery. So Durham, so that's why the remains of Cuthbert is in Durham Cathedral, and the monastery at Durham was a direct kind of descendant of the monastery of Lindisfarne. Now that's a conventional story. There's been increasing work on the historical sources, looking at the more obscure historical sources, and also stuff I've been doing reassessing the archaeology. It's pretty clear that even if some people left, there continued to be a monastery. People continue to come on pilgrimage here. The Vikings continue to attack here, which is actually quite a good sign there's something here. Also, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon sculpture from the island, most of it dates from the point after everyone's meant to have gone. So there's clearly people who are making sculpture, designing it, commissioning it, paying for it. So there's clearly something going on after that period. And then finally the Normans come in the late 11th century, they reform the monastery down at Durham, and then the monks come up and reinvest. They go over this later monastery, and what you see here are the remains of that Norman and later monastery. And this is like a little pocket monastery. It's very small, very compact, and that's partly because of the threats of Scottish raiding. But by this point the Scottish border is in place, and we're getting into that period of Anglo-Scottish warfare. So we've actually got quite a defensible little space here with big walls, and we know that the place did get attacked and raided. That's where it starts. I start losing interest, frankly. So I'm an early medievalist, and I'm interested in primarily the early medieval monastery, the monastery of Aidan and Cuthbert. Now, what you need to do is, if you've ever visited a medieval monastery, forget that, because what we've got here in the early Anglo-Saxon period is completely different to these later medieval monasteries where everything is stone and they have a cloister and a chapter house and a big stone church. The early Anglo-Saxon monastery, apart from the main church, virtually everything would have been built out of wood. It was also huge. The best comparison site we have is Iona, which has seen quite a lot of work, and with lots of geophysics and lots of archaeology. If you dropped Iona, or the area of the monastery of Iona, over Holy Island, it would cover everything from here all the way up to the other side of the village to where the coach park is. So it's a whopping great big monastery, much larger than this little piddly thing down here. So that presents some archaeological challenges. We're trying to understand a huge site through some fairly small holes. There's also lots of practical issues, like trying to dig in the middle of the village is very hard because you've got 500 years of later occupation. So to get to the early medieval period, you'd have to go through 1.5 meters, 2 meters of later stuff. We have no time and money to do that, so we've tried focusing around the edge. So when we started the project, we got money from National Geographic, and we did a big geophysical survey, and we found various places in these green areas around the village where we could see things on the geophysical survey. The first year we put in some trenches over there where we thought we could see the boundary of the monastery. Then we dug it. What we actually had was a medieval road with medieval buildings, which is why you don't throw all your eggs into one basket. You do a series of smaller trenches. We had 1 or 2 early medieval artefacts from there, but it was clear that if you wanted to get down early, you have to get through a lot of later stuff. So we left that. We also did 2 trenches in that big field. One the other side of the path from where we are, which didn't get much, but a couple of little stone features. We did get an Anglo-Saxon coin. In the trench where we're in at the moment, we originally had a smaller trench, and when we got that, we got the first of our name stones, our first of our little carved Anglo-Saxon gravestones, and we got lots of mixed up human bone, charnel essentially. And the carbon-14 dates of that came back as 9th century, 9th, 10th century. So that was bang on the money for what we were after. So in the last 3 years, we expanded the area we're in to try and get a better sense of what we're at. And as you can see, we've got more burials, the building, we've had more sculpture coming out, we've had things like the beautiful little thing we came up with yesterday. So there's certainly Anglo-Saxon stuff down there. These are the excavations which I came up with RKC for a long time ago to talk about before we even started. So we're just to the east of the Priory Church in a field which, as far as we know, has not had any activity in it for several hundred years. And what we've come down to very quickly are archaeological remains. It's quite confusing. It's very hard to understand what's going on. There's lots of settings of stone and bits of things in lines which aren't turning into much at the moment. But broadly speaking, over on our eastern trench, we've had lots and lots of human bone coming up. A lot of it's been disturbed and ploughed. We had a series of proper burials as well, the latest of which were 10th, 11th century, so just Norman. But we also had carbon-14 dated material from the earlier Anglo-Saxon period. And again, we've got this very big stone thing here, which we have no idea what it is. This is the joys of archaeology, it throws up those mysteries. Over here, again, we've not done much on this area. We're starting to come down. We're getting spreads of animal bone, which I think are probably Anglo-Saxon. They're cut by later graves. And over in the far corner, we're getting a building. And it doesn't look much, but it's would have had wooden superstructures sitting on stone pads. And that's cut by graves, so it must be kind of earlier than the graves. So we'll get some carbon-14 dates on those graves. And there's a possible oven in there. There's all sorts of things going on, but we've only ever scratched the surface, and this year we're throwing much more people into it. One of our jobs this year is to work out what on earth it is. But apart from that, surprisingly, there's been very little archaeology done here. Unlike Iona, which is an island off an island, which has been cut to ribbons over the last 50 years, loads of archaeology, we've seen very little work done. A little bit done in the late 19th century. The kind of local lord of the manor, when he cleared out the ruins, which were all covered in rubble, he did a little bit of archaeology, but he's mainly focusing on the late stuff, and it's more landscape gardening than archaeology, frankly. And he did find one or two earlier bits of sculpture. There's another project down there in the 1920s, and again they're focusing mainly on the later monastery. It's run by the Department of Works, who owned it, and again one or two early medieval things, but not much. Other bits of work over in the field just down there. There was some field work, and also along here, done by a guy called Brian Hope Taylor back in the 1960s. Brian Hope Taylor was a fantastic, deeply troubled man, but a fantastic field worker. He's good field working. When I give my Fieldwork 101 course to my first years, I talk about him because he brought big open area excavation to Britain. So you're opening up big areas rather than little tiny trenches or little boxes. So you did this amazing site called Yevering, which is about 14 miles inland. Fantastic Anglo-Saxon palace site. Amazing archaeology dug by him and 5 workmen over a series of about 5 Northumbrian winters. It's amazing. And in the summer of '62, when he finished that, he came here in September, and he completely lost his archaeological mojo when he came here. I'm not sure what he was. He said he had his demons, basically. He died about 10-15 years ago. He'd left archaeology a long time before, and literally his archives were rescued from a skip outside his house. When people see he just left, he had problems. So he'd never published his work here, and we were able to see the archives went up to Scotland, and we were able to see, as part of this project, the first people to see his archives. So we were able to find out precisely where he dug, and again over there he mainly hit medieval stuff. But up here, this is where I mean he lost his knack. Over there, where you've got that stone building, he dug up there because you could see there were like slight earthworks, but he stopped about 10 inches too high. If he'd gone 10 inches down, he'd have hit that and found that big stone building. As it was, he just hit the rubble, the collapsed rubble on top, and he thought he just had a little stone rubble building. He argued it was a church. It's been excavated more recently by a big community archaeology project on the island, not by us, but by another team. It's probably a church. We need to be a little cautious about saying too certainly it's a church. There's nothing diagnostic saying it's a church, but it's kind of circumstantial evidence suggests it's a church. I don't think it's a particularly early one. I think it's more likely to be maybe 10th, 11th, 12th century. I don't think it's a really early church, but it's a really interesting example of them using the wider landscape. It's not just down here, because if you go to Iona, there's a very distinct crag overlooking the main abbey, and I think the way that the landscape here rhymes with Iona, I think they would have noticed that. And again, I think they're almost copying, echoing the planning of places like Iona here. I think they're sure they would have but would have seen that symbolism.
Follow the ongoing progress of the Lindisfarne Holy Island Archaeology Project on social media. Links to Facebook and the Twitter account are available in the video information below.